All right, guys, if you don't mind, we'll get the second NCCoE talk rolling here. So thank you for those who have stayed. I see some familiar faces. So if you thought the last talk was a bit high level in general, you were not wrong. And that's just as a result of where we're at with the various stages of the projects we're in. We're going to present to you our mobile application single sign-on project that we are currently doing for public safety and first responders. This project is much further along. So we have signed creatives, we have technology in the lab environment, we've built things out, we have an architecture. We have standards that are implemented. So I'm hoping this will be a little more exciting for the group here, and we can sort of get down into some of the weeds if anybody would like. One thing that I want to emphasize with this particular project here is, though we are doing this work with public safety and first responders for them, in reality, there's nothing about this project that wouldn't apply across any other sector. If you're using a bevy of mobile applications to access backend SaaS resources on an Android device, and you would like to use your own IDP and federated identity and get a single sign-on experience for those applications, it's likely that you can, if the application supports the architecture, it's likely you can make that happen. In this particular instance, you'll see that the first responder piece is really, they need a diverse set of authenticators because, firefighters wear gloves and, police officers don't want to type in passwords and, facial recognition is hard if you're a nurse and you're wearing a mask. There's that type of thing. But everything you'll see here is really applicable across sectors. So the challenge. So as I mentioned before, we go out to industry. We ask them what their cybersecurity challenges are. In this case, public safety and first responders told us that single sign-on was a big deal. And so in this case, we looked at the public safety first responder community, and mobile platforms have really become ubiquitous for them. And reliance on those platforms and accessing information, critical information, through those mobile applications has really become a way of doing business for them. And so you can imagine a scenario where if you're an EMS personnel and you're showing up to an emergency situation, time is of the essence. Access to that critical information is of the essence. And so we wanted to provide them a strong authentication experience that would allow organizations to have confidence that these people on their mobile devices and through their mobile applications can access things like law enforcement information, health-related information, PII, and then also provide them a single sign-on experience that would save them that time, right? So as they switch from application to application and access different data, maybe they're one time accessing DHS Homeland Security Information Network. Maybe another time they're accessing an FBI database. Maybe they're accessing CGIS. Maybe they're accessing their local municipality database. As they switch those different applications, reuse that same strong authentication, have a good level of confidence in that authentication, and provide that end user that experience. So this is obviously preaching to the choir for CIS. I won't spend a whole lot of time here. Everybody in this crowd has probably seen the XKCD here. We'll reference it a couple times. But public safety first responders are just now hitting some of these password barrier walls, right? As you get to mobile platforms and as you have to switch 3 different keyboards on a touchscreen, uppercase, lowercase, special characters, right? The complexity of these passwords are really becoming a challenge for them. The usability isn't great in terms of being hard to type on the phone. They're aggregating more and more credentials that they have to manage because they keep using these mobile applications, and then that results in often them reusing the same credentials, right? And we all know that where that ends up. And then, passwords in general, as we've talked many a times and years at CS about killing passwords, we all know that they can be phished. And so what is the NCCoE bringing? I touched on this a little bit already, but we are bringing to the table for public safety first responders, multi-factor authentication to the mobile applications, right? So this is not a scenario where you're using the mobile device as a second factor. And then we're bringing a single sign-on experience that leverages that multi-factor authentication. And so you can, sort of envision a scenario where a public safety, law enforcement, EMS individual comes in at the beginning of their shift, does one strong authentication that will last for as long as their IDP wants to allow policy to establish it to last, likely for the duration of their shift. And then that one strong authentication at the beginning of the day will be leveraged via a single sign-on experience for the rest of their access for the rest of the day. So that's sort of the end state we want here, that you authenticate once and you leverage that. You get access to all those applications, and then on the back end, the policy allows, the token-based systems allow for granularity in terms of managing some additional access control, attributes you may want to pass, and especially for that token duration when you want it to actually expire. So quickly, I'll go into some of the benefits of an NCCoE solution. So if you sat in our last talk, you saw we were now just engaging industry, and we were just getting to the point where we were coming up with an architecture. Here I want to talk about the benefits of our work output, the practice guides, the demos, the things you're about to see today. So as I said before, we bring in industry experts. Many of them are actually sitting in this room right now. I won't call them out by name, but there's people in this room who have helped us develop this architecture here. And, so we worked with standards bodies like OpenID and IETF, but we also work with other big names in the industry that are worried about the single sign-on problem and worried about public safety and first responders. And then ultimately, we actually got together and signed those collaborative research and development agreements with 5 players here. So Knock Knock, Cubico, Ping, Motorola, Strongoff, they are the build team that is, along with myself and the NCCoE team, that are rolling up our sleeves and getting into the lab environment and building out the solution. And the technology you'll see here today was contributed by those 5 companies. Most of them have booths here today. Most of them you're probably familiar with, especially if you're familiar with FIDO. So you can talk with us about their tech, but there's many opportunities to talk about that tech at CIS. So as I said before, we are NIST. We are very big fans of standards and best practices, and so you will see a bevy of them in this build. I won't go through the details because we have some more slides later, but we've implemented all of these standards up on the top line here, or best practices, in this build. And then this is a little bit more applicable to public safety first responder communities where, they're used to getting a public safety device that's push to talk that's running like Android 4.4, which we can't emphasize enough that that's not the scenario you want to cultivate. We are using modern mobile technology here. We are using best practices that are dependent upon some of the more modern operating systems and APIs that are available. And we're bringing that to this community. We're helping them by doing some of that market research and helping them modernize their infrastructure. And then, as I've already touched on, this project will result in a freely available NIST Cybersecurity Practice Guide, number to be determined, the special publication 1800-X. And so in that guide, we will be publishing the technical decisions we made and the technical trade-offs we made, the architecture trade-offs that we made. We realized that organizations who want to implement this architecture, it's a your mileage may vary type of situation, and then you may make different architecture decisions than what we made. So we're going to, in the demo, you're going to see sort of one path of decisions that we've made and we've gone down, but in the guidance itself, we'll talk about what some of those other possible paths might be and considerations might be for there. One interesting example is, where do you integrate your FIDO server? Do you do it at an IDP? Do you have a central broker? We had a lot of discussion about the trust model around that and what it might look like. Lessons learned. Right? If you are a wrench turner in your organization or as a hobby, you know that until you get in the lab with the tech, you just don't know exactly what's going to work completely right, even when we're talking about standards, right? Like, they put 500 pages of specification that says it shall do this, and then you get it in the lab and it shall not do that. And so we're going to put in some of those lessons learned. Build instructions. So we were literally putting in some point-click, drag and drop for the tech that we implemented, right? So the assumption there is that for the architecture decisions we made, the trade-offs we made, the path we went down, the tech we implemented, we'll put in that point, click, drag, and drop. And then lastly, we're going to put in some functional tests. So we are not, as a government agency, here to do testing of individual products. We're not here to do vulnerability or security testing. We're not able to test things at scale. Like if you want to test a solution for 1 million users, we're not here to do that. But what we are really concerned about is in our messaging, we say, hey, if you implement an NCCoE build with these standards and best practices, you will get this set of security characteristics and capabilities. And so we realized that anybody who wants to implement a solution like this is probably going to have their IT staff or professional services or an integrator do that type of thing. So we think it's important to put in some functional tests that will allow the data owner, or maybe whoever just has to sign off saying, yes, this statement of work has been completed, to actually test some of those security characteristics and capabilities. So, if we're saying that we are using mutual TLS to federate SAML tokens, we'll show you, hey, this is how you can break down that session and see that, yes, TLS is in fact in place. And then maybe decrypt that session and look at the SAML token and say, yes, the message level encryption is in place. So some of those functional tests is what we call them. And so one of the things for the public comment period we'll really be looking for the communities to provide back to us is, hey, what other functional tests would you like to see? And again, I want to just reiterate this. We are actually, this solution, again, is done for public safety first responders, but it really applies across any sector. And so the standards that we're showing here, you will hear throughout this conference at other talks and sessions, and they will be applicable in other contexts. So we would encourage you to look at this not through the public safety first responder eye, but through an eye of an identity professional who might have a mobile application multi-factor challenge or a mobile application single sign-on challenge. And so with that little bit of context, I'm going to hand it over to William, and we're going to jump right into a demo of this solution for you guys. So we'll show you what we've built out, and then afterwards we'll explain what you actually saw.
Thanks, Bill. All right, before we show the demo, let's talk about what it looks like without single sign-on. So first and foremost, what that means is that each user is going to have to log into each different app separately, and that creates the situation of where end users on the end user side have to create and maintain separate credentials for each app. Or if you're like me, you just rely on email recovery, and if you don't remember your password or put something that's really very complex, just hit email recovery and change it the next time you need to log in, which creates password recovery overhead, on the other end. And then on the app developer service provider side, if they have to develop their own authentication solutions, this can lead to insecure implementations, the challenge of storing and maintaining user credentials securely. So these service providers, their domain expertise is not necessarily in authentication and security like all of us here or most of us here. So we want to make it not their main business concern to help them with this by enabling single sign-on. And all of this is compounded by the challenge of passwords, as mentioned before. Okay. We're going to be looking at two different scenarios with this demo. The first, and each of these scenarios is going to showcase a different FIDO capability. The first scenario is integrating UAF authentication, and we can consider the story about that if there is a single centralized identity provider, or perhaps the identity provider is in the same domain or tightly coupled with the app or service being provided. And then the second scenario is a federated use case where maybe the user has their organizational identity provider that they want to log into, and then we're going to tie into the universal second factor authentication with that scenario. We're going to be showing a couple of Motorola developed apps to demonstrate the single sign-on, and I'm going to cut over to that now. Okay. Okay, so both of these apps, the Messenger app and the mapping app, they're using a middleware app called Cockpit to handle the authentication and authorization interactions. However, I want to stress that this capability can be built directly into the apps as well. It just happens to be that this is the way that these apps operate. I'm going to then log into this Cockpit app. Let me set this up though. In order to authorize users to this backend data, you need to authenticate the users first. And that's where the difference of UAF and U2F authentication is going to be shown. But the core of both of these scenarios is AppOff implementing OAuth 2.0, which is handling the authorization, which is going to happen invisibly, but I'll try to point that out as that occurs. So this is the scenario, to remind you, this is a scenario where maybe the identity provider for this user's, this app is already pre-configured to the app. Maybe it's already known ahead of time which identity provider needs to be used, or there's only one in this environment that you need to use. I've already pre-registered a FIDO UAF fingerprint credential on this device, and that's why it knows to ask me for that specific authenticator. There is a fingerprint scanner on the back of this phone. I'm going to go ahead and scan my fingerprint. And hooray, I'm logged in. So what does that allow me to do? I can log in, I'm logged into this and authenticated to this app. So in here, the authorization to this chat information is occurring silently in the background, but I'm allowed to do that because I'm authenticated to that authorization server, which is what I just had done. All right. Okay, but the real magic here is that now I'm going to open the second app, and I didn't have to sign in or re-authenticate or anything. I'm still logged in. You can see my colleague over in the DC area. He's also using this app as well. Again, in order to pull in that data, I had to be authorized, and that's happening silently in the background. All right. All right, I'm going to switch over to a second profile here. So effectively, you can think of this as another user or a different device. Same apps, but we're going to show a different authentication flow in this case. So as I mentioned before, this scenario, you can imagine like a federated use case scenario where these apps, the backend authorization server for these apps is able to accept identity providers from different sources. So if there is a group of organizations such as the public safety first responder departments and they are part of a federation, then this service provider can allow the selection of what identity provider you log in with. This one accepts an email as the identity chooser, but you can imagine this also being like a NASCAR logo style account chooser screen as well. So I'm at the identity provider domain now, whereas I was at the Motorola backend server domain before. I'm going to log in here. And as I promised before, we're demonstrating a multi-factor U2F authentication solution with this scenario. So I have a Yubico YubiKey hardware token here that I'm going to use in conjunction with the username and PIN that I just did earlier. This phone has an NFC capability, so when I choose to authenticate here, it invokes something that knows how to talk to this authenticator, which is happens to be the Google Authenticator app on Android. If I hold it up to the NFC reader, and prove that I'm actually here by just touching this little metal piece on the token, it will send it will complete the authentication, and now I'm logged in. And just as before, since I'm now authenticated, I'm authorized to the backend data here, and I can access the data from the server. And just as before, single sign-on works, and I can log into apps that are part of this system and authenticate without having to re-enter my credentials again. Okay, so back to the presentation. So Bill will talk about the AppOff piece of it, but I'll speak briefly to the FIDO components that you just saw. First, the second part that we saw, going in reverse order here, is the universal second factor authentication. So this is kind of like the multi-factor solution from FIDO. And we have a few, there's some benefits for using this, which is that, FIDO, both UAF, U2F create site-specific public and key pairs. So your user credentials don't ever leave the phone. It's privacy preserving in the way that the users cannot be correlated across the services. There's an origin check to make sure that whatever's asking for that key is the thing that you're supposed to receive that key, and then they'll get that. Again, in UAF, because this is like the passwordless side of the FIDO, since you can use other things other than password, even if you use a PIN, because the user credentials never leave the system, that's a big benefit for using this, as well as the usability benefits of avoiding the password problem. All right, I'm going to kick it back to Bill. And,
so thank you, William, for the brief demo. So again, standards. You might catch a theme here. So how do when the community first came to us with this mobile single sign-on challenge, right? My initial reaction was, hey, mobile security guys at NIST, how do we handle this? And they actually came to me and said, we're not really aware of a great way of handling this. And so it was, if you guys are familiar with John Bradley, who his face is all over this conference, he was the one who said, well, I got this great IETF BCP that he co-wrote with William Dennis. William's actually in the crowd back there. Raise your hand, William. Yeah, props goes to these guys for spending a lot of time looking at these standards and best practices and working through the drudge that is IETF to get them published. But this is really the core of the single sign-on piece of this build, and it does use OAuth. And so in this case, it's implementing the OAuth RFC. We're also implementing that proof key for code exchange, PXE. If you've been to CIS a few times, this came out a couple years ago, you've probably heard about PXE. That helps to make sure that there's a cryptographic challenge for some of these access tokens that are passed between the authorization server on the back end and the mobile client. As I said before, we're moving from a password system to a token-based system, right? And so this was really enabled, I don't know if anybody has really kept up with this space on the mobile apps, but it was really enabled a couple versions of Android, a couple versions of iOS ago, when they allowed the mobile applications access to, on Android, what's called a custom tab, and on iOS, what's called the Safari View Controller. And so that allowed us to provide some token-based architectures and some single sign-on capabilities that removed the need for actually exposing the user's passwords and credentials to the SaaS provider or the mobile application, right? So what you saw William do right there, especially in the second scenario, was he went and logged into his IDP and use whatever credentials ID provided him, right? And then that authentication information was passed over to that SaaS backend, and then a token was issued. And that would happen for every single one of the applications that you're gaining access to. Those tokens are nice because they come with a limited scope of authorization. So as I said before, we are not here to demonstrate authorization policy. We're not here to demonstrate all the things you could do with those tokens. But one of the benefits is that you can scope the user down to a specific token expiration, or even a specific set of actions they can do when they have that token. We also enable, but are not demonstrating, IDP that allows for the passing of attributes. In the public safety first responder community, they are very much looking at federation scenarios, communities building out attribute contracts and profiles. We are not here to demonstrate that. That is not a core part of this build, but from a future-proofing perspective, we wanted to highlight the fact that when you're using SAML tokens and OIDC tokens and JWTs, you can pass these attributes on to the back end. I already touched on this. We implemented Pixie here, which provides some additional security benefits in the BCP. And then this BCP is agnostic to the authenticator, right? So what we didn't actually, what we showed here today is a SAML-based authentication. We do have up and running in our lab environment an OpenID Connect version of that same thing. We realized that various communities will have various federation infrastructures, so we wanted to be able to support both of those. And then I want to talk a second about AppOff. So AppOff is an actual Android and iOS SDK, software development kit, that implements that best current practice, right? So if you just quickly Google AppOff, you will find this logo. You will find 2 Git repositories. This is completely free and open source that has this implementation. And so this was actually developed by the OpenID Foundation, and it was made free and open source. And the code for both iOS and Android is actually maintained, I think maybe just by William back there, and a small. Okay, sorry, I don't know you gentlemen, but you get credit as well, by a small crack team that have been working for several years in this space to develop and refine and gain adoption of this flow. And I will encourage you, if you want to see more about AppOff, there is, I think, a 4:30 to 6 o'clock session that talks about the latest versions of AppOff and the capabilities, and something called YOLO, which I think is you only log in once. Did I get that right? Yeah. So I would encourage you guys to go see that later. Obviously, the benefit of this SDK, though, is the security, the BCP, those standards, they're implemented already out of the box, right? So if you heard our colleague this morning with Tasni talk about, man, for IoT, we really need to make sure these developers know how to implement this stuff, make it their life easier, right? Well, this is one of the ways we do that, right? Just go pull this SDK down. That said, this is not the only way to implement the BCP. Right? The best current practice is out there and stands unto itself, and any developer who doesn't want to use a third-party SDK could read it and implement that flow themselves, so they choose. And so I just hit all those points. And then just to highlight some of the benefits of tacking FIDO onto this, right? We talked about them just a second ago, but FIDO is a nice standards-based way, also authenticator agnostic way of adding, of achieving that multi-factor authentication, right? We talked about none of the secrets being served on the server side, right? So if we're looking at all the secrets that are in the system, we already talked about with AppOff, we don't actually have to provide those credentials to the back end, and we don't have to provide those credentials to the actual app itself. With FIDO, that biometric template stays on the device. With the YubiKey, that private key stays on that device, right? So none of those secrets go server side. And then, of course, FIDO is much harder to phish than passwords would be. And you can go to the FIDO booth. You can hear the entire FIDO spiel. I would encourage you, if you're not familiar with it, to check those out. There'll be FIDO. They may actually have a session right now going on. So I'm glad you came here and not there, but you should check out the FIDO stuff this week as well. And so now I will turn it back over to William, and he's going to go into the second part of our demo for registration.
All right. So earlier, when showing the authentication, I kind of hand-waved that things were pre-registered. But of course, thinking about the whole authentication life cycle is important when considering these kind of solutions. So yeah, maybe it's easy to log in that once, but what does it take to set all this up for the users? So let's start with the UAF registration, that fingerprint that I had shown earlier. There's many ways to do this, but the story I'm going to tell today is that, There we go. The story I'm going to tell is that perhaps we have a administrative, IT or security administrator at your organization, and they're the only one who has access to the FIDO UAF registration system at your organization. Then the end user comes and brings their device. They get verified however your organization wants to verify them physically. I know him. He's there. Brings the. Let me put this on the same screen here. So brings their device. Now we have to set up the FIDO UAF credential on the device. So let's go ahead and register. Because we're using the Knock Knock UAF server, they have a handy app to just read a QR code that will set up the registration on the device to the server. So go ahead and do that. Here I get a handy options of various authenticators that are available on this device. And this depends on the UAF SDK or implementation that you have, and also what's physically capable with the device. So I'm going to choose fingerprint. Go ahead and register my fingerprint again. Great, and now in the administrative FIDO console here, I can see that, okay, for this user, I have this credential registered now. For completeness, I'll show that that actually works here. Hooray, I'm logged in. Okay. And you can imagine deregistration working a similar way where the administrator or sometime then will remove that registration of that credential, UAF credential. We'll show a slightly different path for the U2F registration. And again, this is highly dependent on your organization's specific authentication policies around authentication and the authentication lifecycle, but we are just showing some examples of how things might work just to show that it is possible in a sane way. Okay, in this case, since we're exercising the user multi-factor authentication, we're going to say the story here is that once the user logs in, initially, the user logs in with their username and password to authenticate. Oops. You guys know my password. All right.
Don't worry, we're about to add a second factor.
All right, so the story here is now they log in, and maybe we allow them to self-register their additional factor here. So I'll go ahead and do that. In the same way, it invokes the Google Authenticator on the phone because that knows how to read the NFC on the device. Now that's registered, and so I can authenticate as I had done before. Okay, so that concludes the registration demos, and I'll pass it back to Bill.
So that was it. That was a combination of two different FIDO credentials using both U2F and UAF. That was the AppOff-based, the best current-based implementation of AppOff using mobile single sign-on. There's a lot of other security elements that happen behind the scenes. If you thought that was underwhelming, well, that's because if you do security well, right, that's kind of the way it happens, right? What we didn't show to you guys, because it's a little more laborious, is hey, let's have someone log into every app individually, right? But that's really what you're saving the user from doing, in addition to provide all of these security benefits. So where are we going with this entire effort? So as I already mentioned earlier, we have collaborators, we've signed creatives, we've built out this infrastructure. So we are adding to this build. So we right now we showed you a close coupling between the UAF and the backend application and a federated U2F scenario. We're going to add a federated UAF scenario to this as well. So we have our own IDPs in our NCCoE lab environment. We're actually standing up a UAF server there from Knock Knock and getting that up and running. We want to have support for shared devices. Shared devices may not be as big of an issue for other sectors, but for public safety first responder, like if I'm an EMS and I need to give this phone to the person next to me so I can now do CPR, that's a critical scenario for them. And so we're going to show some things that you can do at least initially on Android platforms around device policy controllers that would allow us to, and separate profiles that allow us to help handle that shared device scenario. And then we'll look at some support for single logout. This is a topic that, if you're not aware of, is a real challenge with single sign-on. So great, I've established all these sessions and I've transacted all these tokens, but now I need to break things down. And so we're going to be looking at some of that as well. That's not the core, it's not really core to this build. And then, of course, we're going to publish a practice guide, a SP 1800 series document for this effort. We're hoping to have a draft version of that out sometime in the October timeframe, so a little closer than our other project. And again, we'll list the technical decisions we made, the trade-offs, the lessons learned. We will list, the guidance for areas outside of what we just demonstrated here. So we'll talk a little bit about things like credential recovery, revocation, maybe touch on identity proofing. We'll reference some things around federation and some of the considerations that go into that, right? So not all of that was in scope for the demo because, the larger the scope the demo gets, the less likely you are to get it to work every single time. If you notice, that was a pretty flawless demo guides presentation right there. So we'll talk about a lot more inside the practice guide than just what we demonstrated here. And then with that, I will open it up to some questions. Sir?
When you talk about this mobile SSO, how do you handle this scopes? Different apps,
Mm-hmm.
So how do you guys handle it when the scope changes between?
Yeah, so I maybe missed it earlier. I mentioned that we are not really tackling the authorization piece, right? So that's going to be up to the individual entities that are implementing this solution. So I don't think we're going to do complete justice to the waterfront on that particular space. Did you want to say something, William?
No.
Okay.
It's more of like, I understand that what you're talking about, but trying to understand how we help the organization.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, if you have specific ideas or use cases that you would like to see us handle, or specific just difficult questions that you haven't seen handled well in other spaces, one of the benefits of the NCCoE is that we can sort of throw them back to our build team and the industry experts that we're working with, and we can talk about what that might look like. The NCCoE has the ability to put out guidance and documents that aren't necessarily the big practice guides that we put out. So it could be that we could help in that space agnostic of this particular effort. Yep. Adam? Sir?
I think Adam just said it, but I don't know if anybody can hear it. But you do have an OAuth pattern,
Mm-hmm.
the authorization server sitting there, it actually needs specific scopes. So
Yep.
not defining an authorization model per se, I've got a pattern over where
Yeah, the infrastructure to support it.
the entry point is the set
Yep.
authorization.
So I just wanted to add though, but I think the challenge is that works if everyone's like talking to the same authorization server and sharing the same scopes. But if I think the challenge that Bill was like addressing was that if that's not the case, that's out of scope for us. So, but we'd be happy to hear more use cases about that to work on that as well.
Yep.
The OAuth is delegated authorization, so that
Yep.
the apps will request some scopes.
Yep.
And will ask consent for those scopes.
Correct. Yep.
Right, so to go back to the original question, if you ask for, if your client application knows all of the scopes that it's going to need, that first login knows all of those scopes, it can ask for all of those and get the persistent consent that he was talking about. If a new app comes along and the scope is changed or something like that, probably in most cases want to ask consent again.
Yep.
But that's a
Yeah, and to be fair, for public safety first responders, they're very cognizant of the user experience. They're very cognizant of how many screens you're going to display. You notice we separated authentication and registration for that exact reason, because we found that they really didn't understand the difference between the two, and that registration is like a one-time thing. So we actually turned off all those authorization screens. We wanted to present to them the least amount of screens that the user needed, but they are there, and you could make a business decision as to whether or not you want to implement them. Yep. Sir?
Just a comment, I guess, one thing that I see really nice about this pattern is that the app can actually support 100 different IDPs.
Yep.
Because it's all kind of a black box as far as the app is concerned. It's all up to the server implementer. So I think in the past, if you look at like old app models, the app would have to understand every IDP individually. And if you wanted to add an IDP, the app would need to update. And I think what's really great about this model, particularly with FirstNet or any kind of enterprise use case, like you could imagine like every department has a different IDP, but the app developer doesn't have to worry about that.
Mhm.
It can all be handled on the server. So that's really positive.
Do you think there's scope for building a standard library for some of these cases where we're integrating AppOff with FIDO? So the AppOff containers, I'm interested in seeing if we build something on top of that.
Mhm. Yep. So I would say that that's more of a, the NCCoE would like to bring these smart people together to enable that type of thing. In terms of making it actual, saying, hey, build team members, build this, we probably wouldn't say that, but if there was a natural outcome from an NCCoE project because of the work we've done together, we would see that as a positive. And if you would like to have greater interaction with the project and the build team members and what that might look like, I can help provide an audience to make that discussion happen. Mm-hmm. Any other questions? So with that, we have additional content currently publicly available that you can find out about this project. So our initial project description statement that we put out at the very beginning for public safety is on our website. You can see our more detailed flow diagrams there of all the standards we've implemented, the SAML, the OAuth, the OIDC, and such. And then we actually just recently announced our build team just a few weeks ago. So we have a quick blog post up there about some of the technologies we're using and the build team members that have signed up. And then, of course, you can reach out to our general distro, and you will get me and the team that has been working on this effort. So with that, I will thank you for your time and attention.